Thank you very much. It's always wonderful to be back in Bombay, a city I grew up in and have come to enjoy. And, when you have an introduction of the nature I've had here today, I know I'm being set up. But I particularly like the fact the conversation went on to BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes. I have nothing against those wonderful cars as long as most of them are manufactured in the United States. And in the global world that we live in, what is not lost on me as we were looking at the hybrid cars and photovoltaic technologies is American companies with American technologies setting up in an export promotion zone in China and exporting for BMWs in Germany. So we are very much in a global world, and in that world, we need to see what is it that we can all do together to move business forward. But it is about coming back to Bombay. I often mention I went to a school not too far from here, which is probably about 3.5 miles from here, called Jamnalal Bajaj Institute of Management, which is where I did my MBA. I often ate at a restaurant which is probably less than that. I continued to pay club membership over 30 years, I don't know why, to a club which is just probably a few meters away from here, Bombay Gymkhana. So in very many ways, this is coming back home. I am, however, here to speak to you about, I thought, a few themes which may be well in line after the wonderful visit our President had here just a few months ago. And I thought it would serve us best if we spoke about a policy framework which President Obama and his administration initiated, which is really about how do you enhance U.S. competitiveness through innovation, education, and commercialization. So I wanted to speak to you on that theme. And as a part of it, to speak to you about what we call the National Export Initiative, where there are very specific goals about doubling exports, which Dr. Rangaraj alluded to. But we are in India, and I will tie it up with India in terms of why India is so important in the context of a global trade policy. And finally, how does all this happen? What is the win-win in this for every country in the world? And in that context, I'd like to speak to you about collaboration as part of commercialization and execution. So if you look at it in that context, let's talk about the overall American policy of enhancing competitiveness. When President Obama took office, he inherited the biggest economic decline and the most challenging economic climate any one of us in our lifetimes knew about. It's clear that going back to the old policies and trying to repedal and do better at some of the things we always did was not going to be an answer moving forward. We really had to look at enhancing competitiveness, but through investments in our future, not necessarily in our past. And when you look at it in that context, we also realize that America is best when it's innovative. So let me go back to the Mercedes-Benz and the BMWs. It is America which gave the world automobiles. Ford car which you drove really bears the name of an entrepreneur who introduced automobiles to the world. If you look beyond that into planes, the U.S. did provide the world planes with Wright brothers. So let me ask you in that context, we do know computers which you use or iPads which I use also came from the United States. In a garage of Hewlett-Packard is where computers were developed. And yes, there is an inventor of the internet. So let me pause for a moment and ask that question. Do you know who invented the internet? Anybody in the auditorium?
Physicists at CERN.
Physicists?
At CERN, Geneva, this very big research center of physics.
Well, as we understand it, and we know about this, the internet and GPS, the global positioning system which you have in your cars today, were invented at the same lab by the same teams. And that was called DARPA, D-A-R-P-A. That's Defense Advanced Research Labs in the United States. So it was used initially for military purposes and defense purposes, and through public-private partnership or government-private partnership, we were able to commercialize that after a period of time. So when you look through all these areas of innovation, there were pockets of innovation which came, and we knew that America was at its best when it was in its inventive mode. And taking a cue from that, as we inherited the worst economy the world saw, the president decided to come up with his plan of a stimulus package in the United States to spur the economy and reinvest back in innovation. And he did that, just to give you the example, we talked about the internet. He did that taking a leaf from the DARPA angle to set up what's called ARPA-E in the energy area, which was a lab within the U.S. Department of Energy to have transformational, innovative projects which could change the world. So, if you can conceive of a car or a pickup truck, the size of which could power the entire state of New York in terms of electricity needs, that was the type of transformation we're looking at. Or, going back to a lab, to how do you convert, through bacteria, hydrogen and water into energy. 38 such projects were funded in the first year through the stimulus pack which we came up with. The additional area was, all this was fine. So we were looking at what are the industries of the future. I know I met a few people from infrastructure. We were talking about renewable energy. These were areas where we had pockets of strength. These were areas which we could take and commercialize. And these were areas that intuitively felt right, that we needed to invest in our future. In and through the investment comes a few critical issues people often forget, because we jump into exports. It's wonderful. I did think we needed to take a step back and say, where does export fit into the overall policy framework? And that is, how do you nourish innovation? You do that by encouraging research and development. You do that through patent protection. That's very important when we look at it in the global sphere. How do we protect the intellectual property of people who bring up this technology? And furthermore, and particularly critical in the Indian context, how can we get over this rhetoric? How can we get over this urge and the need for local content? There's a very thin line about protecting an entrepreneur's technology and insisting on local content. So that's the innovation component, even before commercialization. But no innovation is sustainable if it cannot be replenished or if it cannot be sustained over time through education. So the second pivot of the Obama administration's policy was always on education, whether it was K to K-12 education, as we call it, which is the school level education, or community colleges within the United States, or investing back in R&D at major research-based universities in the country. Because if you had the right innovative technology, you needed to have the scale and the right skill set which would make this scalable across the world. And the third side of this was commercialization. That's wonderful. Now we have the innovation, we have the technology, we have the sustainability through education. How do you commercialize this? And that is the entire concept of connecting technologies, products, and services with markets in the world. And it is in this context of commercialization that the President outlined his policy of what he called in the last State of the Union address in the United States, the National Export Initiative.